Close your eyes and imagine this. You're about to cross the Atlantic Ocean, but not in an airplane, not in 8 hours. You're boarding a wooden ship the size of a house, with 200 strangers. No GPS, no weather forecast, no radio, no engine, just sails, wood, and the hope that the wind blows in the right direction. The journey will take between 8 and 12 weeks, if you're lucky. The food will start rotting by week 3. The water will turn green with algae by week 4. Storms will arrive without warning. Disease will spread in the darkness below deck. And there's a very real chance you'll never arrive. 1 inch, 10 ships simply disappeared. No trace, no explanation, just the ocean keeping its secrets. This isn't fiction. This was the price of crossing the Atlantic in the year 1700, and tonight we're going to experience it together. Not as tourists, but as passengers. We're going to feel the creak of wood beneath our feet. Smell the hot tar on the ropes. Hear the absolute silence of the open ocean. For the next 90 minutes, you'll be on that ship. Because before transatlantic flights existed, before luxury cruises, before crossing the ocean was ordinary, it was this. And it was extraordinary. Welcome aboard Time's The Hopeful Venture. Our journey begins in a port on a foggy morning in the year 1700. Chapter 1. The Final Terrestrial Hour. Dawn arrived not as a sudden illumination, but as a slow leaching of color back into a world carved from granite and shadow. The port, a geometric puzzle of stone quays and timber jetties, lay slick with a cold silver dew. Each massive block, fitted by hands long turned to dust, wept moisture that gathered in the seams between them, creating a fractured mirror of the lightning sky. Above this wet stone stage rose a silent, wintering forest, but one comprised not of trees but of ships. 100 masts speared the pale air, their complex rigging a black web against the gray, a cat's cradle of hemp and hope holding the sleeping canvas close. The air held a specific, profound perfume, a base note of tidal mud, that rich, decaying smell of the continent's edge, layered with a sharp tang of tar warming on hulls and the dry, grassy scent of coiled rope. Among this gathered fleet, one vessel waited with a particular, patient solidity. The hopeful Venture Times was a creature of oak and iron, a 3-masted merchantman whose hull bore the scars and sheen of previous passages. Her sides, curved like a great beast's ribcage, were a tapestry of texture. Here, the smooth, almost polished sweep of planking below the waterline, slick with green weed. There, the rougher, tarred expanse above, marked by scuffs from forgotten wharves. At her stern, a gallery of ornately carved wood foliage and mythical sea creatures, now softened by time and salt, projected over the water, a final architectural vanity before the wilderness of the sea began. From her bowsprit to her towering mainmast, she was a city of rope. Halyards, sheets, and stays formed a vertical labyrinth, all leading up to the yards where the great sails were furled tight into neat, horizontal cylinders awaiting their purpose. The gangplank, a single narrow tongue of worn wood, connected this wooden world to the enduring stone of the quay. It was the final filament, the last terrestrial connection. To stand upon it was to hover between two states of being, feeling the immutable solidity of the land through the soles of one's boots at one end, and at the other the faint, disconcerting give of the ship's deck, already answering some deep, slow rhythm of the harbor's water. The atmosphere thrummed with an impending transition, a collective holding of breath. The cries of herring gulls sliced through the damp air, their white forms wheeling like scraps of paper against the solemn backdrop of the town's gabled roofs. From a distant spire, a clock began to peal the hour, its bronze notes spreading across the water, each one a measured reminder of the time-bound world being left behind. Carts rumbled on the cobbles, their drivers' shouts muffled by the damp. Men moved along the quay with the deliberate focus of last-minute rituals, checking manifests, securing lines, their breath puffing in small, transient clouds. On Time's The Hopeful Venture's deck, a few sailors moved with quiet efficiency, their footsteps a soft percussion on the planks, their eyes occasionally lifting to the sky, as if reading the weather in the slow shredding of the clouds. The land, for all its noise and smell and solidity, already seemed to be receding, its gravity weakening with each toll of the bell. The ship, creaking softly as it nudged its fenders against the dock, was a capsule of contained potential, smelling of its own interior world of damp timber, old spices, and the faint, metallic scent of the chain locker. The gangplank awaited only the final order, the last passenger, the ultimate severance. It was a narrow bridge over a profound divide, and the hour for crossing it was now measured not in tasks, but in heartbeats, in the final, conscious savoring of unmoving earth before the long surrender to the sea's endless sway. Chapter 2. The Wooden World, Part 1. The gangplank was drawn aboard with a final hollow thud, the sound of a door closing on a previous life. Underfoot, the deck timbers of Times. The hopeful venture Times were no longer an abstract surface, but a new and tactile reality. They were broad planks of dense, weathered oak, their grain raised and polished by countless boots and salt waves, yet still firm and solid as continental rock. Between them, a hardened black seam of pitch and oakum kept the sea at bay, a network of dark rivers on a pale wooden plain. The sensation was one of slight, constant movement, a gentle, living roll that communicated the harbor's deep, slow breath directly through the soles of one's feet. From the forecastle came the first deep, organic groan of the voyage, the sound of wood and men straining against the ocean's grip. The capstan, a vertical drum of massive timber, began its slow, clockwise rotation. Men leaned into the wooden bars inserted into its head, their backs bent, their footfalls, a synchronized shuffle on the deck. The thick hemp cable, wet and heavy, emerged from the hawsehole inch by laborious inch, coiling itself in muddy, dripping loops on the deck. With each groan of the mechanism, a profound shudder traveled up through the cable into the ship's very spine, a vibration felt in the teeth and the marrow. It was the sound of the anchor breaking its clutch on the seabed, of the ship reclaiming its freedom of motion. Then came the wind. It was not a gale, but a firm, insistent pressure from the northwest. Aloft, sailors became tiny, agile silhouettes against the brightening sky, loosening the gaskets that bound the sails. Canvas, heavy with damp, began to unfurl with a series of soft, percussive cracks, like distant gunfire. The great mainsail dropped from its yard, a vast, pale rectangle that hung limp for a heart-stopping moment before the wind found it. It filled with a deep, resonant boom, a sound felt in the chest as much as heard. The ship shuddered again, but this was different, a lean, a gathering of purpose. The deck tilted a few deliberate degrees to leeward as the first real thrust of the wind pressed against that immense sheet of cloth. The quay began to slide past, the water between hull and stone widening into a choppy, green lane. This main deck was a world of intricate architecture. At the stern, the quarterdeck rose like a low stage, a platform of authority where the helm stood. The ship's wheel, a twin-spoked giant of polished oak, was connected by a web of ropes and pulleys to the rudder far below, a mechanical nervous system. Before it, the binnacle stood sentry, its wooden hood waiting to shelter the compass that would soon become the arbiter of all direction. Nearby, the ship's bell, cast from dark bronze, hung in its wooden frame, its interior still dry, its voice yet unsounded for this passage. Amidships, the galley chimney, a short iron pipe piercing the deck, issued a thin, tentative plume of gray smoke that the wind instantly shredded, carrying the faint, comforting scent of burning oak. Forward, the architecture turned practical. Pens constructed of rough-sawn timber held a small, bleating flock of sheep and a few clucking chickens, a portable farmyard whose earthy smells mingled with the salt air. Water barrels, lashed securely to ringbolts, stood in neat rows. The deck itself was crisscrossed with obstacles, the bases of the masts, thick as ancient trees, the hatch combings leading to the darkness below, coils of rope as big as cartwheels, each one a precise, layered nest of potential energy. Every inch was dedicated to function, a testament to the brutal economy of a space that must contain an entire society for months. The coastline, that solid, familiar world of church spires and clustered roofs, of green hills and smoking chimneys, began its retreat. It softened, its details blurring into a uniform gray-green smudge. The individual cries from the quay melted into a single, faint murmur, and then into silence, broken only by the new language of the ship, the hum of wind in the rigging, the creak of timbers, the liquid hiss of water parting before the bow. The smudge on the horizon grew thinner, a mere pencil line between sea and sky, and then, with a final, almost imperceptible sigh from the sails, as they fully trimmed to the open sea, it vanished entirely. The transformation was complete. The last vestige of the old world was gone, swallowed by the circular, empty horizon. The hopeful Venture Times was now a solitary, wooden world, committed utterly to the vast, trackless blue, bearing its cargo of lives, dreams, and livestock into the immense and waiting silence. Chapter 2. The Wooden World. Part 2. The world below decks was a realm of perpetual twilight and compression, a stark inversion of the sky-dominated expanse above. Descending the steep, narrow companionway was an act of submission, each step a surrender of light and horizon, a journey into the ship's visceral interior. The ceiling here was not a ceiling but the underside of the main deck, a low, curving plane of massive oak beams so close that a tall man had to move in a permanent stoop. The air changed instantly, growing thick and still, saturated with a profound and complex odor. It was the smell of the ship's own substance, the damp, sweet-rot scent of ancient timber sweating in its own confinement, mixed with the dry, dusty aroma of unwashed straw from mattresses and the inescapable, warm, salty tang of close-packed humanity. This was the passengers' quarters, a long, narrow cave running along the ship's flanks. Along both walls, built into the very structure of the hull, were rows of narrow bunks, stacked 2 and 3 high. They were not beds, but wooden drawers, each one a shallow, coffin-like box, barely wide enough for a man to lie on his back. They were separated by thin partitions, offering not privacy, but merely a definition of space. Within each, a thin pallet of lumpy straw lay over the bare planking. A single small sea chest at the foot of each berth contained a world reduced to its absolute essentials. The only illumination came from a single storm lantern, its flame protected behind thick glass, which swung from a central beam with a slow, hypnotic, perpetual arc, casting monstrous, undulating shadows that made the walls themselves seem to breathe. The light it gave was a dim, smoky orange, a pool of gloom that deepened rather than dispelled the darkness in the corners. The gentle, ceaseless roll of the ship was amplified here, translated into a constant, groaning protest from every joint and timber, a symphony of stress that spoke of the immense pressures of the deep water outside this fragile wooden shell. Moving further down, past a second, even narrower ladder, led into the true belly of the vessel, the cargo hold. Here, the last vestiges of the lantern's light were swallowed by a cavernous, echoing darkness that seemed to have its own physical weight. The air grew colder, damper, and was filled with a new palette of scents, the dry, aromatic dust of spices seeping from nailed-shut crates, the sour tang of damp ballast stones shifting in the bilge below the floorboards, the faint, ghostly sweetness of wine from a few privileged casks. Eyes, given time to adjust, could make out the shapes of the hold's inhabitants. Great, dark barrels of salt provisions, stacked like pillars in a cathedral. Rectangular crates containing God knew what manufactures from the old world, all lashed down with a spiderweb of ropes to keep them from becoming deadly projectiles in a storm. The space was immense, a hollow core running the length of the ship, and every sound was magnified and distorted. The creak of the hull became a deep-throated moan. The rush of water past the planking outside was a constant, whispering reminder of the abyss just inches beyond the wood. A dropped tool would ring with a startling, metallic clarity that seemed to hang in the frigid air for seconds. In this absolute darkness, the ship completed its transformation into a total, enclosed universe. Above was the realm of wind, sun, and stars, governed by the compass and the helm. Here below was the realm of stored life and slow decay, of breath and dreams and sustenance, all cradled in a resonant darkness that pulsed with the ocean's own heartbeat. The outside world ceased to exist. There was no horizon, no sky, no passing cloud. There was only this, the smell of damp wood and humanity, the feel of a rough timber partition under a searching hand, the sound of the sea's intimate whisper against the hull, and the gentle, inescapable sway that was the new truth of gravity. The Time's hopeful Venture Times was no longer a vessel on the sea. It was a wooden world containing a sea within itself, the sea of its own dark, creaking, fragrant interior, sailing through the greater, silent sea beyond its planked walls. The journey had turned inward, the vast external emptiness now matched by a profound, resonant internal one, a self-sufficient microcosm carrying its own atmosphere, its own rhythms, and its own fragile cargo of light and life through the eternal dark. Chapter 3. The Measure of Days. Time, on the open ocean, shed its terrestrial shackles. It was no longer marked by the chimes of a town clock or the predictable rhythms of market and meal, but by the slow, majestic turn of celestial bodies and the humble, gritty tools of human estimation. The primary instrument of this new reckoning stood aft on the quarterdeck, encased in its wooden binnacle, the ship's compass. Its brass bowl, gleaming dully in the daylight, housed the card upon which the world was reduced to 32 painted points. The needle, suspended in spirit, trembled with a life of its own, forever seeking the north, a sliver of magnetized faith in a world of fluid horizons. The helmsman's entire existence was bent to its silent command, his hands on the spokes making minute adjustments, his eyes forever flicking to that dancing card under its glass, holding a line against the sea's perpetual persuasion. More visceral was the sandglass. Mounted in a wooden frame near the helm, it was a simple cylinder of blown glass, its waist pinched, its interior filled with fine, pale sand. Every half hour, as the last grains whispered through the neck, the watch on duty would turn it with a sharp, practiced flip. The action was a sacrament, a mechanical heartbeat for the wooden world. The glass itself was worn smooth at its ends by countless hands, its measure of time eroded slightly by the abrasion of its own passage. The turning marked the watches, the dog watches, the middle, the morning, structuring the endless day into manageable portions, each flip a small burial of a finite future into the accumulated past of the voyage. The true temple of time, however, was the navigator's cramped, curtained-off domain near the great cabin. Here, in a pool of lamplight, lay the tools for measuring the immeasurable. Charts, their corners weighted with lead weights, showed coastlines that were memories or rumors, and vast, empty stretches marked only with the cautious script. Sea supposed uncharted. The astrolabe, a brass wheel of intricate, engraved circles and sighting vanes, was for capturing the sun's altitude at its zenith. The cross-staff, a simpler, older device of plain wood, required the navigator to face the sun directly, aligning its sliding crosspiece until the shadow touched the horizon. An act of balancing fire and water, that left phantom suns dancing in the eyes. These were lonely, precise rituals, performed in a space that smelled of ink, varnish, and the faint ozone of mathematical concentration. Here, a man with dividers and parallel rulers attempted to fix a speck of wood in a universe of blue using angles drawn from the heavens. But the true, undeniable clocks were the sky itself. Dawn broke not with a bell, but with a quality of light. It arrived as a cold porcelain gleam in the east, painting the undersides of the clouds in washes of rose and pearl. On deck, it cast shadows that were sharp and impossibly long, stretching the rigging's web into a distorted, skeletal blueprint across the planking. The world felt new-scraped and fragile in that horizontal glare. Noon was the abolition of shadow. The sun stood directly overhead, a fierce, white coin in a hard, bleached dome. The light became a palpable weight, hammering the deck into a blinding plane of reflected heat, making the pitch between the planks soft and fragrant. Details were scorched away. The ship existed in a stark, minimalist reality of light and heat, a silent, blazing apex. Then came the long, golden decline. Sunset was not an event, but a gradual suffusion. The light lost its aggression, turning thick and honeyed, flowing across the western sea in a molten horizontal flood. It caught the sails, transforming the weathered canvas into sheets of hammered gold, and set the rigging aflame, each rope and shroud etched in brilliant coppery line against the darkening sky. The world grew soft, edges blurring, colors deepening to royal purple and burnt orange. This was the day's final generous measure, a slow pouring out of light that seemed to stretch time itself, elongating the moment before the first star pricked the velvet blue. The ship sailed through these celestial hours, a silent witness to the only dial that mattered, the slow arc from sharp, hopeful dawn through the demanding truth of noon to the contemplative, golden surrender of dusk, each day a complete revolution in the great silent clockwork of the sky. Chapter 5. The Larder and the Galley. Sustenance on the Times, hopeful venture times, was a matter of grim inventory, a dwindling arithmetic against the endless sea. The galley itself was a dank, soot-blackened closet wedged between the foremast and the livestock pens. Its sole dominion, a squat brick hearth built upon a bed of sand. A small iron chimney, perpetually warm, pierced the deck above. Within the hearth's black mouth, a meager fire of oak chips and dried dung smoldered, its heat absorbed by a single, massive copper pot that sat directly on the bricks. This pot, its sides stained a permanent burnt umber, was the heart of the ship's culinary life. Within it, a thick, grayish stew known as lobscouse simmered for hours, days, becoming a perpetual entity. It was a homogenized universe of boiled salt meat, shattered hardtack, and dried peas, its surface occasionally broken by a slick of yellowish fat. The smell that wafted from it was neither appetizing nor repellent, but simply a constant, salty, porridge-like odor that permeated the forward deck, a bland beacon marking the hour of mess. The storerooms, low-ceilinged cells adjacent to the galley, were temples of preservation, where food was rendered nearly inert to defy time. Here, in the perpetual gloom, barrels were stacked like pillars. The salt pork and beef barrels exhaled a pungent, briny aroma. The meat within, packed in coarse salt, had the texture of dense, fibrous wood, requiring hours of soaking and boiling to become merely chewable. Casks of hardtack, the ship's biscuit, stood in silent rows. To lift a lid was to release a dry, floury dust. The biscuits themselves were pale, thick discs, harder than the ship's planking. In the dim light, a careful observer could see the biscuits were not still. A faint, subtle movement animated their surfaces. Weevils, tiny and pale, navigated the lunar landscape of the bread, their slow migrations the only sign of independent life in the larder. Eating was an exercise in tact, often done in half-light or with eyes averted, the faint, bitter crunch of carapace just another note in the texture. Sacks of dried peas, like small lumpy corpses, slumped in corners. They would be tossed into the lobscouse, where they softened into mealy, bland pellets. The liquids were guarded with even greater reverence. Small kegs of water, lashed securely, developed a warm, flat, woody taste as the voyage wore on. The beer, a dark, low-alcoholic porter, was marginally better. Its slight acidity and faint sparkle, a fleeting relief, though it too grew stale and lifeless in its casks. The monotony was absolute, a sensory deprivation as profound as the sameness of the horizon. Taste buds, assaulted initially by the aggressive salt and strange textures, eventually numbed into resignation. Eating became a purely functional ritual, a transfer of calories, the act dominated by the smells of the galley wet ash, boiling salt, and the ever-present damp wool of the cook's jacket. The cook himself, a silent man with forearms laddered with old burns, was a priest of this minimalism. His world was the soot, the steam, and the precise daily allocation from the purser's ledger. He wielded a heavy ladle like a scepter, dipping into the copper pot to dispense identical portions into wooden bowls. There was no artistry, only distribution. The texture of the food was its primary characteristic. The rubbery give of the salt pork, the gritty mush of the peas, the soggy, disintegrating slabs of weevil-riddled hardtack that thickened the stew. In this wooden world, where the senses were starved of novelty, the daily meal underscored a profound truth. They were living on stored time, consuming the past in measured increments. Each barrel tapped, each sack opened, a physical countdown through the calendar of hunger. The larder was a landscape of slow depletion, its diminishing contents the only calendar that truly mattered, a silent, sobering measure of the distance still to sail, written not in leagues but in sacks of peas and the crawling, infinite patience of the weevils. Chapter 6. Skies and Swells. The sea, in its benevolence, offered days of such profound and empty peace that the voyage seemed less a journey than a state of suspended being. The ocean shed all violence, all caprice, becoming a vast, breathing plain of muted color and subtle motion. Its surface was not a uniform blue, but an infinite tapestry of gradients, each shift in depth or cloud shadow painting a new hue. Close to the hull, the water was a translucent slate gray, shot through with cold, greenish light where the sun penetrated. Farther out, it deepened to the dense bottle green of ancient glass, a color that held the light within it like a secret. At the horizon, it merged with the sky in a band of soft, milky azure, the line between them so delicate it seemed drawn with a single hair of a brush. The surface was not flat but alive, with a slow, muscular heave, a pattern of low, rounded swells that moved with the stately rhythm of a sleeping leviathan's breath. Each swell was a rolling hill of water, its back a smooth, oily sheen, its face a gentle slope that caught the light and shattered it into a million fleeting diamonds. Above this serene expanse, the sky was a vast, inverted bowl of palest gray and white. High cirrus clouds, torn into delicate filaments by winds unseen at the surface, scudded in silent procession. They were not the dense, dramatic clouds of weather, but wisps of ice crystal, mare's tails that feathered across the dome, hinting at velocities and temperatures far removed from the gentle world below. The sun was a diffuse, silver coin behind this veil, its light softened and distributed evenly, eliminating harsh shadows and rendering the world in a monochromatic dreamscape of subtle tones. The air itself felt washed and clarified, cool against the skin, carrying only the clean, mineral scent of the sea and a faint ozone freshness from the heights. The hopeful venture's movement was reduced to its most essential form, a gentle, rhythmic roll. As each swell passed beneath her keel, the ship would lean, with a slow, deliberate grace to starboard, pause at the apex of the tilt, as if considering the horizon, then swing back through center to port, with the same languid certainty. It was not a motion that disturbed the stomach, but one that soothed the spirit, a cradle's rock on a monumental scale. The timbers of the hull and masts voiced their contentment in a soft, symphonic language of creaks and groans, each sound a note of stress released, of wood settling into its natural, fluid environment. The sails, full but not straining, stood as pale, curved wings, their wind a constant, gentle pressure that propelled the ship forward with silent, effortless power. The soundscape of such a day was one of whispers and isolated notes. The dominant voice was the liquid whisper of water parting along the hull, a continuous, shushing sigh that spoke of easy progress. It was joined by the soft, irregular tap of a loose line, a halyard perhaps, or a sheet tapping against a mast with a wooden cadence, like a slow, patient heartbeat. Aloft, the wind hummed a single, low note in the rigging, a resonant bass that thrummed through the very fabric of the ship. Human sounds were absorbed by this immense quiet. A footfall on the deck, the clank of a bucket, seemed intrusively loud, their echoes quickly swallowed by the soft, all-encompassing murmur of the sea. Only the occasional cry of an albatross, far overhead, pierced the stillness. The great bird was a master of this empty realm, a white cross gliding on motionless wings along the invisible highways of the air. Its cry was a lonely, mournful sound, a sharp, melancholic note that seemed to emphasize the silence that followed. It would circle the ship once, a distant, graceful specter, then tilt a wing and vanish into the featureless sky, leaving the world once again to its profound, elemental peace. This was the ocean's true face, not an adversary, but a vast, indifferent companion. The mood aboard was one of quiet absorption. Men went about their tasks with a subdued, almost reverent air. There were no urgent shouts, no frantic activity. The immense, empty piece of sky and swell seeped into the wooden world, slowing time, calming thought, reducing existence to the simple, rhythmic facts of breath, sway, and the endless, gentle hiss of the wake unfurling behind them into the timeless blue. It was a peace that bordered on emptiness, a serene and magnificent void in which the ship was merely a fleeting thought, a tiny, conscious speck moving through a dream of water and light. Chapter 7. The Distant Fury. It began as a smudge, a faint thickening on the western horizon that for hours could be mistaken for a bank of haze or a trick of the wearying light. But this smudge did not dissipate with the afternoon. It coalesced, building upward with a terrible, deliberate patience. By the fourth watch, it had defined itself against the pale sky, an anvil-shaped mass of cloud, its top flattened and sheared by winds at the roof of the world, its underbelly a bruised and purpling black. It was a continent of vapor, a mountain range born of the sea's own exhalation, and it moved with a slow, majestic indifference that was more frightening than any speed. From the deck of Time's The Hopeful Venture, the spectacle was a silent, breathtaking theater. The storm was a day's sail away, perhaps more, moving on a parallel course to the north, and this distance rendered it soundless. The violence was muted into pure image, a chiaroscuro of apocalyptic beauty. Lightning lived within the cloud's heart. It did not strike downward in single, jagged bolts, but stitched the far-off sea to the sky with continuous, branching veins of cold white fire. These luminous fractures would illuminate the entire monstrous formation from within, revealing caverns and towers of tumultuous vapor, before vanishing and leaving a deeper darkness in their afterimage. Sometimes, a great sheet of diffuse light would pulse behind the cloud, turning its edges to molten silver and casting an eerie, second-day glow across the intervening sea. This distant sea itself was transformed, a sheet of hammered lead catching the sporadic light, while around the ship the water remained its familiar bottle green, highlighting the unreality of the scene. The air aboard changed. It grew heavy, tangible, charged with a static potential that raised the fine hairs on the back of the neck and made the skin feel acutely sensitive. The usual salt breeze freshened, becoming a steady, cool stream flowing from the east, as if the very atmosphere were fleeing the turmoil ahead. The sails, which had hung slack in the morning's calm, now bellied out with a firm, confident curve, and the ship picked up speed, her bow wave hissing a little louder. But this wind was not a threat. It was a gift, a clean avenue of escape offered by the colossal weather system. The helmsman held his course with a taut vigilance, his eyes constantly measuring the angle between the ship's heading and that distant, crawling fury. A respectful, watchful tension settled over the wooden world. All non-essential work ceased. Men who had been mending sails or scrubbing decks now stood at the rail or found vantage points in the shrouds, their faces turned westward, their expressions unreadable mixes of awe and primal caution. There was no fear, for the storm's path was clear and their distance safe, but there was a profound, humbled recognition. They were witnessing the raw, untamed power of the element they inhabited, a force that could, with a slight shift of the wind, reduce their orderly world of oak and hemp to splinters and drowning men. It was a reminder of their true scale, not adventurers conquering the deep, but insects skirting the edge of a boot. The light played strange tricks. A shaft of sunlight, breaking from the clear eastern sky, would spear across the deck, setting the polished bell and the wet planks ablaze, while the western half of the world was a study in monochrome violence. The black of the cloud was absolute, a depthless void, while the silver-lit sea beneath it shone with a cruel, metallic brilliance. The ship itself felt like a fragile partition between two realities, the sane, sunlit world of their course and the insane, magnificent one they observed. As the afternoon waned, the storm began to pull away, its northern trajectory slowly increasing the blessed gap of sea and sky. The lightning became less frequent, the great anvil cloud softening at its edges as it marched towards some other horizon, some other ship, perhaps less fortunate. The electric weight lifted from the air, leaving it clean and cool. The wind, on times, the hopeful venture times, settled back into a steady, gentle press. Men slowly returned to their tasks, their movements deliberate, their conversations hushed. The distant fury had passed, leaving behind not damage, but a deep, silent imprint on every soul aboard. They had seen the ocean's true temper, not in its punishing waves, but in its distant, silent, electrical heart. It was a vision that would linger in the quiet of the night watches, a reminder that their peace was ever alone, and the horizon could always gather itself into a mountain of purple-black rage, silent, majestic, and utterly indifferent to the hopeful ventures of men. Chapter 8. The Nocturnal Watch. B.S. Darkness on the open sea was absolute, a consummation of the day's emptiness into something profound and tactile. When the last copper gleam of sunset drained from the western sky, swallowed by a horizon that ceased to exist, the world contracted to the immediate wooden reality of the deck and the immense, star-strewn vault above. The ship became a ghost of itself, its masts and rigging dissolving into a deeper blackness against the lesser black of the sky. The only concession to human presence was a single soft glow amidships, the binnacle lamp. Its flame, sheltered behind thick greenish glass, cast a feeble, circular pool of light that illuminated little more than the lower half of the helmsman's face. In that golden upward wash, his features were rendered stark and solemn, the deep grooves from nose to mouth, the concentrated set of his jaw, the unblinking eyes fixed on the trembling compass card within. His hands, resting on the spokes of the great wheel, were pools of shadow, their movements slight and constant, guided by the faint, magnetic whisper from the bowl. He was the night's solitary priest, tending the only earthly light. Other human signs were fleeting, spectral. From the direction of the galley chimney, now cold and silent, a sudden red spark would sometimes bloom in the blackness, a tiny, fierce sun that lived for the duration of a drawn breath. It was a sailor lighting his pipe, the match's flare illuminating for an instant a cupped hand, a weathered profile, a puff of smoke that vanished instantly into the cool air. Then the spark died, and the darkness rushed back, deeper for having been breached. The ship's bell, mounted near the helm, was a shape without form, a deeper lump in the gloom. At the regulated turns of the glass, a figure would emerge from the shadows, take the rope, and strike the bell once, a single, resonant, bronze tone that seemed to bloom in the air and then roll outward, absorbed by the murmuring blackness. It was a sound that measured not progress, but endurance, marking another half-hour's passage through the eternal night. Above, the sky was a revelation. Freed from the sun's tyranny, it unveiled a cosmos of impossible density. The stars were not the polite scattered pinpricks of the land, but a dense, brilliant powder flung across a velvet so deep it seemed a substance. They were countless, layered, some steady and cold as diamond chips, others shimmering with a faint, anxious pulse. They had weight and presence, pressing down with a silent, glittering pressure. And through the zenith flowed the Milky Way, no faint smear, but a clear, luminous river, a spilled cascade of icy light that bisected the heavens with a soft, granular radiance. It was a road of frost and dust, so vivid it seemed one could almost hear its cold, silent flow. To look up was to feel a vertigo, not of height, but of depth, as if the ship were poised on the brink of a well into infinity. Below, the sea was a murmuring blackness, a void more complete than the sky. It gave back no light, offering only a soft, rhythmic hiss as the hull passed through it, a sound like endless silk being torn. Sometimes in the ship's wake, the blackness would stir with a secret life. Phosphorescence, stirred by the passage of the rudder or a deeper swell, would ignite. It began as a few scattered greenish-blue sparks, like cold fireflies drowning. Then, as the agitation spread, the wake would become a churning trail of liquid light, a ghostly, bubbling highway stretching back into the night. Individual droplets flung from the sides would glow with a brief, stellar brilliance before vanishing. This cold fire had no heat. It was a chemical memory of the day's sunlight, a silent, eerie echo of life in the abyssal dark. It illuminated nothing but itself, making the surrounding sea seem even blacker. The ship, in this nocturnal realm, ceased to be a vessel of purpose and became a mere inhabited shape, a tiny island of warm breath and creaking timber, adrift in a cosmos. The watch on duty moved like shadows, their footsteps soft on the dew-slick planks. Conversations, when they occurred, were hushed, as if the immensity overhead demanded reverence. The cold seeped up from the sea, a damp chill that found its way through wool and leather. Time lost all meaning, except as marked by the lone bronze tone of the bell. Each stroke was an anchor, a tiny assertion of order in the vast, star-dusted chaos. In those silent hours, the mind turned inward, or expanded to fill the universe. The immense peace of the day was replaced by a different, more profound stillness. The stillness of being a speck of conscious warmth, surrounded by an ancient, beautiful, and utterly indifferent night. The helmsman held his course, his face a mask of gold in the lamp's glow, steering by the faint tremble of a needle, guiding their wooden speck of world through an ocean of ink and a sky of frozen fire, while the bell's solitary voice spoke, again and again, of the slow, patient passage through the dark. Chapter 9. The Interiors in Monsoon Light. The rain arrived not with the sudden violence of a squall, but with a soft, pervasive insistence that blurred the world into a single, damp sigh. It began as a darkening in the air, a thickening of the gray cloud ceiling until it hung just above the mastheads, heavy and full. Then the first drops fell, fat and solitary, making dark, coin-sized stars on the dry planks. Within minutes, the isolated taps became a steady, drumming rhythm on every horizontal surface. The closed hatches, the furled sails, the taut canvas covers over the livestock pens. It was a sound without beginning or end, a white noise that filled the ears and smoothed the edges of thought, reducing the entire seascape to the immediate, wet shell of the ship. On deck, the world dissolved into 1,000 silver threads. The rain fell straight down in a fine, persistent curtain, softening the lines of the rigging, turning the masts into vague, gray pillars. The scuppers, unable to drink fast enough, overflowed, creating murmuring rivulets that chased each other across the camber of the deck before vanishing into the freeing ports. But the true life of the rain was found below. Despite the battened hatches, water possessed a sly, gravitational cunning. It found the unseen seams, the minute cracks, weathered by sun and salt. In the passenger quarters, the drumming from above was transmuted into a more intimate, irregular music. Drips, born somewhere in the labyrinth of deck joints and channels, found their way through. They fell with a soft, clear times, plink times into an assortment of pots, bowls, and buckets placed strategically on the floorboards. Each drip had its own tempo, a slow, thoughtful pulse from a leak near the mainmast, a quicker, chattering patter from a seam along the hull. The air below grew thick with the sound of water finding its way home. The light in that low-ceiling space was transformed, rendered strange and submarine. What little illumination filtered down through the wet, latticed gratings of the deck hatches was a dim, greenish gray, the color of pond water under ice. It did not illuminate so much as stain the surfaces it touched, lending the rough timber walls a sickly, phosphorescent hue. The straw in the mattresses looked dank, the wool blankets heavy and inert. Shadows lost all definition, bleeding into a general gloom that seemed to seep from the corners themselves. The usual storm lantern, lit early, swung in its slow arc, but its flame fought a losing battle against the damp oppression, its orange glow unable to push back the pervasive, watery twilight. To move through the quarters was to move through a broth of shadow and sound, every sense tuned to the soft, incessant percussion from above and the irregular, metallic chime from below. The atmosphere grew physically close, saturated with a palpable humidity that beaded on the cold oak beams and made the linen shirts of the passengers cling to their skin. The air was a composite of damp smells. Wet wool from drying garments hung from hooks was the most immediate, a sour, animal odor of lanolin and mildew. Underlying it was the pervasive scent of the ship itself, the damp wood, now exhaling a colder, earthier version of its usual sweetness, like a forest floor after a long rain. From the galley chimney, struggling against the downpour, came a thin, acrid thread of wood smoke. The fire, fed with damp kindling, refused to draw properly, and the smoke seeped back along the deck, adding its bitter tang to the humid mix. It was the smell of confinement, of a world turned in upon itself, all its usual odors concentrated and amplified by the moisture. It became a day of enforced introspection and profound stillness. With the decks awash and no horizon to watch, the usual rhythms of the voyage halted. There were no sails to trim, no lines to coil in the sun. The watch stood huddled under the slight shelter of the quarterdeck overhang, their duties reduced to mere presence. Below, passengers remained in their berths or sat silently on their sea chests, listening to the architecture of the rain. The gentle, perpetual roll of the ship felt different now, slower, more viscous, as if the very ocean had thickened. The usual creaks and groans of the hull were muted by the blanket of sound from above, leaving only the deep, organic complaints of the major timbers. Time stretched and softened, measured not by the turning glass but by the gradual filling of a water pot. Thoughts, with no external vista upon which to project, turned inward, navigating the familiar, cramped channels of memory and anticipation. The wooden shell, which so often felt like a prison, now became a sanctuary, a fragile, resonant drumskin, keeping the soft, immense fury of the sky at bay. Within it, life was reduced to its simplest elements: the sound of water, the smell of wet wool and struggling fire, the feel of damp air on the face, and the slow, patient accumulation of drips in a clay bowl a day carved out of the long voyage and given over entirely to the quiet, green-gray contemplation of the monsoon's gentle, soaking breath. Chapter 10. The Great Blue Desert. The ocean, in its most elemental state, was neither benevolent nor cruel. It was indifferent, and this indifference was a weight more crushing than any storm. The days dissolved into one another, each a perfect, maddening replica of the last, until time itself seemed to bleed into a single, endless present. The horizon was no longer a boundary but a prison wall, an unbroken line of flawless geometry that held them at the exact center of a perfect blue circle. In every direction, the view was identical, the seamless suture, where a pale, bleached sky met a deeper, more profound sea. There were no clouds to measure progress against, no birds to suggest a world beyond the water. The sun was the only traveler, a tyrant crossing the dome from east to west with a slow, pitiless certainty, its passage the day's sole event. This celestial monarch ruled with a brutal clarity. It rose as a white-hot coin, already fierce, burning away any morning haze before it could form. By midday, it stood directly overhead, a furious, blinding eye. Its light was a physical assault, hammering the deck planks until they were too hot to touch barefoot, making the pitch between them soft and fragrant, like warm tar. The air shimmered above the wood, a visible haze that distorted the few vertical lines of the ship. Shadows contracted to nothing, pooling thinly beneath the boats and barrels, leaving the world exposed in a stark, minimalist reality of glare and heat. The sailors moved through this with a slow, economized gait, their faces shaded by wide hats or wrapped in cloth, their skin taking on a leathery, baked quality. Thirst became a constant companion, a dry, nagging awareness underscored by the warm, wooden taste of the rationed water. The wind, that capricious spirit, would sometimes die entirely. The sails, which had been full curved wings, would slacken, their great bellies collapsing inward with a series of soft, sighing flaps. They hung limp, ghostly, and useless, the complex web of rigging suddenly slack, allowing blocks and lines to tap a random, idle cadence against the masts. The ship would lose her way, her forward motion ceasing until she wallowed, a dead thing in the water, turning her broadside to the gentle, oily swells. The silence in these moments was profound, broken only by the liquid slap of water against the stationary hull and the mournful creak of the yards shifting overhead. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a subtle shift in the pressure on the skin, a new breath would stir. A cat's paw of wind would darken a patch of water in the distance, rushing toward them. The sails would fill again with that deep, familiar boom. The ship would heel gratefully, and progress would resume. But the interruption only emphasized the fragility of their enterprise, their utter dependence on a whim of the air. Behind them, the wake stretched a straight, white scar on the blue skin of the sea. It was their only proof of movement, a frenzied, bubbling path of disturbed water that churned from the stern. Yet even this mark was ephemeral. Within a few hundred yards, the turbulence would subside, the bubbles would vanish, and the white line would fade, its edges softening until it was absorbed back into the seamless blue. The sea healed itself behind them with a silent, effortless efficiency, erasing their passage as if they had never been. It was a daily lesson in impermanence, a visual proof that their journey left no lasting impression on the vastness they traversed. The psychological weight of this environment was a slow, cumulative pressure. The immense scale of the ocean reduced the ship from a vessel to a speck, a tiny, conscious splinter adrift on a continent of water. The mind, seeking a fixed point, found none. The sheer, monotonous grandeur bred a deep, aching longing for any change, any flaw in the perfection. Men would stare for hours at the empty horizon, willing a cloud to form, a distant sail to appear, a solitary bird to cross the void. The arrival of a single wandering albatross, that same lonely specter, would become an event of intense focus. Its graceful arc followed until it vanished, leaving a sharper emptiness behind. The color of the water, always blue, became a subject of obsessive scrutiny. Was it a greener blue today, or a grayer one? The quality of the light at sunset was analyzed for omens. This was the true trial of the voyage. Not the storms, but the silence. Not the danger, but the sameness. The great blue desert offered no landmarks for the eye and no variety for the soul. It was a crucible of patience, where the spirit was sanded down by the endless, gentle abrasion of identical days, leaving only the raw, quiet core of waiting, a hollowed-out resilience under the tyranny of the unbroken circle and the healing sea. Chapter 10. The first new smell. It came not as a sight, but as a scent, a faint, almost ghostly alteration in the morning air that for a long moment defied identification. The dawn had broken like any other, with a cool, pearly light spreading across the eastern sea, the ship rolling gently in a lazy swell. The watch had changed, the bell had struck, and the world seemed another iteration of the endless blue. Then, as a sailor high in the mainmast crosstrees paused to wipe sweat from his brow, he caught it. A mere hint, a whisper, riding the clean salt breeze from the west. It was not the sharp, mineral smell of the open ocean, nor the dry, baked scent of the deck. It was something earthy, vegetal, and profoundly foreign. It was the smell of mud, not tidal harbor mud, but the deep, fecund mud of a continental shelf, of river silt and decaying leaves, stewing in sun-warmed shallows. It was the smell of land, not as a place, but as a biological fact, carried on the air for 100 leagues. On deck, others began to sense it. It was not a strong odor, but a subtle shift in the atmosphere's composition, like a single new instrument joining an orchestra already playing. Men paused in their work, nostrils flaring, eyes turning instinctively to the western horizon, which remained its usual unbroken line. The scent came and went, teased away by a capricious eddy of wind, then returned, stronger, more definite. It carried within it the memory of roots and damp soil, of stagnant brackish water and sun-bleached seaweed rotting on a beach. It was a scent that spoke not of human habitation, but of the land's own slow, wet breath. After weeks of air scrubbed clean by thousands of miles of empty sea, it was shockingly complex, almost overwhelming in its suggestion of teeming, unseen life. The environment, so long static, began to whisper its conclusion in other tongues. Within an hour of that first muddy breath, birds appeared. They were not the lone, majestic albatross of the deep ocean, but smaller, noisier, more purposeful creatures. Gulls, their wings a sharp, clean white against the blue, materialized as if from the air itself. They circled the ship with sharp, inquisitive cries, a different sound from the mournful wail of the sea-going birds, more edged and pragmatic. Terns joined them, darting on knife-blade wings, their movements jerky and anxious. They did not follow the ship out of lonely curiosity, but investigated it as a temporary feature in their coastal world, their presence a definitive sign that the barren oceanic desert was ending. Their cries created a new layer of sound, a busy, chattering counterpoint to the wind's hum. The very color of the water beneath the hull began to change. The profound, depthless sapphire of the open sea softened, diluted by an infusion of green. It became a murkier, more opaque hue, a bottle green shot through with brownish threads, as if the seafloor, rising from the abyssal plain, was reflecting its muddy secrets upward. The light penetrating the surface no longer vanished into a blue void, but seemed to hit a ceiling and diffuse, suggesting shallows below. The ocean's surface lost its pure oceanic polish, taking on a slightly oily, variegated texture, patched with areas of smoother and rougher water where currents from unseen river mouths mingled with the sea. Then came the flotsam. First, a single branch, waterlogged and barkless, bleached white by sun and salt, bobbed past the starboard side. It was a skeletal finger pointing nowhere. Then a clump of bladderwrack, its pods still glossy, trailed a few strands of green. A little later, a mat of finer seaweed, the kind that grows on rocks in the littoral zone, floated by like a discarded rug. These were not the sparse, sargassum weeds of the ocean gyres, but the litter of a coastline. Each piece was a tangible fragment of the world they approached, a broken-off piece of the continent drifting out to meet them. They were silent messengers, confirming what the nose and the birds had already proclaimed. Finally, the light itself seemed to alter. The sharp, crystalline clarity of the mid-ocean air, which made every rope and sail edge look newly carved, began to soften. A faint haze, invisible itself, gathered on the western horizon, blurring the hard line where sky met sea. It was a land haze, born of the evaporation from forests and rivers, of pollen and dust lifted from dry ground. It gentled the glare of the late afternoon sun, turning its light from a white hammer blow into a diffuse golden wash. The sunsets, which had been violent explosions of color against the black horizon, now promised to be richer, smokier, filtered through the exhalations of a world of trees and soil. No land was yet visible, no dark smudge broke the line, but the environment itself had shifted. The absolute dominion of the sea was ending. Its pure, empty language of wind, wave, and sky was now infused with new vocabulary. The scent of mud, the cry of gulls, the greenish murk of coastal water, the debris of shores, the softened light of terrestrial haze. The Time's hopeful Venture Times was no longer sailing through a void, but through the outermost field of a giant's influence. The immense, indifferent peace of the blue desert was gone, replaced by a gathering tension, a silent, sensory fanfare announcing that the long isolation was over. The world was no longer empty. It was waiting. Chapter 11. The Smudge on the Horizon. It was the boy in the foretop who saw it first, his young eyes sharpened by boredom and the height. He did not shout, but simply pointed, a silent, steady finger aimed west-southwest. Others followed his gaze, hands shielding eyes from the low afternoon sun. For a long time, there was nothing but the usual seamless join of sea and sky, a line trembling in the heat haze. Then, as if willed into existence by their collective hope, it appeared. Not a cloud, but something different. A low, dark line, a smudge of charcoal on the pale blue paper of the horizon. It was so faint, so insubstantial, that to look away was to risk its disappearance, a mirage born of longing. But it remained. It did not drift or change shape like cloud. It held its position with a solid, terrestrial patience. A quiet, electric current passed through the ship. Word traveled not in shouts, but in hushed repetitions and the sudden cessation of idle work. Men climbed into the shrouds for a better view. Passengers emerged from below, blinking in the sunlight, their faces turned toward the west as if pulled by a magnet. The smudge was a rumor given form, the answer to the whispers of scent and bird and water. All eyes were fixed upon it, measuring, doubting, believing. The helmsman felt the change in the air, a new tautness in the silence, and his grip on the wheel tightened minutely, as if the ship herself had grown eager. Over the next hour, under the gilding light of the late afternoon sun, the smudge began to resolve. It thickened, gaining dimension against the sky. The uniform dark line started to show texture, a subtle variation in tone that suggested not a mere bar, but a profile. The sun, sliding lower, caught its upper edge, painting it with a thin, fiery rim of gold, while its base remained a mysterious, cool purple. It was no longer a smudge, but a shape. The naked eye could begin to parse its form. There, a slightly higher hump that might be a hill or headland. There, a gentler dip that hinted at a bay or river mouth. It was a coastline. The quality of the light transformed the approach into a visual feast. The sun, now a swollen orange globe, hung just above the horizon, its rays stretching across the sea in a broad, shimmering highway of molten copper that led directly to the land. This horizontal illumination sculpted the distant shore with a painter's detail. The dark line revealed itself as a fringe of trees, a ragged silhouette of green-black that from this distance looked like fur on a giant's back. In places, the tree line broke, suggesting cliffs of bare rock that glowed a deep, rusty red in the sunset light. The colors were profound and impossible at sea. The rich, dark green of endless forest, the warm ochre and umber of stone, all backlit by a sky that was shifting through spectra of apricot, rose, and deepening violet. On board times, the hopeful venture, activity changed its character. The languid routines of the blue desert vanished, replaced by a sense of taut expectancy that thrummed in the very planks. The captain and navigator stood together on the quarterdeck, speaking in low tones, their fingers tracing invisible lines on a chart held between them. The navigator's crossstaff was brought out, not for longitude, but for taking careful bearings on the emerging headlands, triangulating their position against this new, solid reality. Orders were given, not loudly, but with a crisp precision that had been absent for weeks. Sailors moved with a renewed purpose, adjusting lines, making ready for the more complex sailing that coastal waters would demand. The course was altered, not dramatically, but with a series of minute, deliberate adjustments. The helmsman, his eyes flicking from the compass to the distant shore and back, nudged the great wheel a spoke to port, then a half spoke back to starboard, fine-tuning their approach. The ship's bow, which had pointed for so long into pure emptiness, now had a fixed target. Every slight turn of the wheel felt momentous, a final editing of their long, arcing path across the world. The sails were trimmed with exquisite care, catching the steady wind to maximize their speed toward that glowing, beckoning line. As the sun dipped closer to the horizon, the details of the land grew richer, more tantalizing. The uniform green of the forest canopy broke into variations patches of lighter, almost lime green, suggesting different types of tree or clearings, streaks of dark shadow that might be deep ravines. The cliffs showed striations, layers of sediment written in stone. The air, even from miles out, seemed to carry a new density, a palpable presence that was the collective breath of a continent of soil and leaf and root. The ship sailed on, a tiny, purposeful silhouette on the vast, burnished sea, drawn inexorably toward the solid, beautiful, and unknown reality that had finally risen from the realm of dream and map to fill the western horizon with its silent, waiting mass. The voyage's great emptiness was over, replaced by the profound, imminent presence of land. Chapter 12. The Quiet Approach, Part 1. The ocean, having held them in its blue palm for so long, now began to relax its grip. The profound heaving swells of the deep sea gentled into a shorter, choppier motion, a busy, cross-hatched pattern of small waves that slapped against the hull with a new, chattering energy. This was the influence of the continental shelf, the seafloor rising like a giant's shoulder from the abyss, disturbing the water's deep rhythms. The hopeful Venture Times responded with a quicker, more nervous roll, her timbers creaking in a higher register, as if whispering amongst themselves about the change. The water itself lost the last of its oceanic clarity. It churned around them in a murky, opaque green, thick with suspended silt, the color of moss in a shady stream. Sunlight no longer plunged into vanishing blue depths, but reflected back from this fertile murk, giving the sea's surface a dull, matte finish. Other sails began to punctuate the horizon, the first sure sign they were rejoining the world of men. They were distant specks at first, tiny white triangles that might have been gulls' wings. But they held their shapes, moving on deliberate courses. A coastal schooner, low and lean, beat its way southward, its sails taut. A heavier, bluff-bowed lugger wallowed under a load of timber, moving slowly inshore. These were not the rare, distant companions of the ocean passage, but working craft, going about the daily business of a populated coast. Their presence made the sea feel domesticated, a highway rather than a wilderness. The sight of them sent a quiet thrill through the ship, a confirmation that the land ahead was not a mere forest, but a place of commerce and community, a destination with a waking life of its own. The coastline, a dark wall the previous evening, now unveiled its details as morning mist burned away in the rising sun. They were sailing past a series of great headlands, colossal shoulders of rock cloaked in dense, dark green. Each headland was a monument, its cliffs streaked with vertical seams where water ran, its crown a tangled fortress of pine and fir. As the ship rounded one such promontory, the world opened. The headlands fell back to the north and south, revealing the wide, welcoming mouth of a great river. It was not a narrow cut, but a vast, calm estuary, perhaps several miles across, where the sea's salt green mingled with the brown, fresh water flowing from the continent's heart. The river's current met the ocean in a visible, swirling line of froth and drifted debris, a liquid frontier. The ship, with a final, gentle adjustment of her helm, crossed this soft boundary. The motion changed instantly. The choppy sea swell was replaced by a long, smooth, oily roll. The sound of the water along the hull softened from a slap to a sigh. They were inside. The air, which had carried hints for days, now enveloped them in a thick, palpable blanket of scent. It was an overwhelming symphony after the sterile breath of the sea. The dominant note was pine, a crisp, resinous, clean smell that seemed to scrub the lungs. Underlying it was the rich, damp, profound odor of earth itself, of leaf mold and black soil, a smell so solid it felt like something one could bite. And weaving through it all, carried on the slightly warmer air drifting from the southern shore, was the sweet, fragile perfume of blossoms, wild apple, or cherry perhaps. A hint of nectar that spoke of gentle climates and spring. It was an aroma of incredible complexity and vitality, a shock to senses dulled by months of salt and tar and damp wood. With the scents came sounds, real terrestrial sounds, that carried over the calm water with a new, clear fidelity. From the dense woods lining the banks came a cacophony of bird calls, not the lone cry of the albatross, but a busy, argumentative chorus. The sharp drilling times, rat-a-tat times of a woodpecker echoed. A jay's harsh scold ripped through the softer background chatter of unseen songbirds. Then, from far inland, came a sound that was profoundly, definitively human, the distant, hollow report of an axe biting into a tree trunk. It was a single, spaced times, thwack, thwack, a sound of labor and possession, marking time in a way the ship's bell never could. It was the sound of the new world being built, and it landed on the quiet ship with the weight of an announcement. The environment was overwhelmingly, almost aggressively, lush. Where the ocean had been a minimalist expanse of blue and gray, this river world was a cacophony of green. The banks were a solid wall of vegetation, a tangled vertical jungle of trees, vines, and undergrowth that rose from the water's edge and climbed the hills beyond. The greens were countless, the dark blue-green of fir, the brighter yellow-green of new maple leaves, the silvery green of willows dipping their branches into the slow current. Moss coated every rock and fallen log in emerald velvet. Sunlight, filtering through the dense canopy, dappled the water and the ship's decks in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. After the elemental simplicity of the sea, it felt riotous, crowded, alive, with a million forms of hidden, scrambling, growing life. The very air felt thicker, richer with oxygen, and the silence of the ship as she ghosted up the broad river was one of stunned absorption. The crew and passengers lined the rails, not speaking, their eyes wide, drinking in the solid, fragrant, noisy reality of the land that had been a dream for so long. The voyage's great silence was over, drowned in the gentle roar of living green. Chapter 12. The Quiet Approach. Part 2. The river embraced the ship with a calm, deliberate intimacy, its brown water parting in a smooth, silent V from the bow. The deep-sea winds were gone, replaced by faint, capricious breezes that wandered down from the wooded hills, smelling of damp fern and warm bark. Progress was now a matter of patience, of drifting forward on the last of the tide and the occasional helpful zephyr that filled the topsails with a soft, rustling sigh. The crew moved with a quiet, focused diligence, readying lines and fenders, their eyes not on the empty horizon, but on the approaching bank, scanning the water for hidden snags. The ship felt different, no longer a self-contained fortress battling an element, but a visitor gliding into a settled realm, its noise and scale suddenly conspicuous against the primeval quiet of the forest. The settlement revealed itself not as a sudden town, but as a slow accumulation of human marks upon the wilderness. First came the cleared fields, great raw scars of yellow earth on the green hillsides, where tree stumps stood like rotten teeth amidst the rough furrows of new-turned soil. Smoke rose from within the trees, not the singular thread of the ship's galley, but multiple, steady plumes from unseen hearths, a vertical forest of gray rising into the still air. Then the buildings appeared, scattered along the higher ground above the riverbank. They were structures of raw, unweathered timber, their logs still showing the pale yellow of fresh-cut pine, the chinking between them a stark white. Roofs were of rough, split shakes, already silvering in the sun. There were no streets, only muddy tracks leading from one simple, square-framed house to another, and larger, barn-like structures that spoke of communal storage or work. It was architecture in its most fundamental state, a pragmatic imposition of geometry upon the chaos of the forest. Closer still, and the waterfront took shape. A few wooden piers, little more than sturdy platforms on pilings, jutted into the river. One longer wharf, built of massive bark-clad logs, showed signs of recent construction, its ramp muddy from cart wheels. A handful of smaller boats, a dugout canoe, two flat-bottomed skiffs were drawn up on a narrow strip of gravel beach. On the wharf, a few figures had stopped their work to watch the ship's approach. They stood still, axes or coils of rope forgotten in their hands, their faces pale smudges at this distance. Their very stillness was a form of communication, a silent assessment of the newcomer from the sea. The ship, with its towering masts and complex rigging, must have seemed an apparition from another world, a ghost of civilization drifting into their hard-won clearing. The moment of arrival was not announced by a shout or a bell, but by a deep, mechanical thunder from the bow. The anchor, a great hook of black iron, was released from its cathead. It plunged into the brown water with a violent splash, and then the true sound began, the rush of the chain. It roared out of the hawse hole, a deafening, metallic cataract that shattered the river's calm. The links, each as thick as a man's wrist, clattered and ground against the wooden hull, a furious, rattling descent that spoke of immense weight and finality. The noise echoed off the wooded banks, sending birds screeching from the trees. It was the last, violent gesture of the voyage, the ship physically clawing at the riverbed to halt its long momentum. Then, as suddenly as it began, the roar ceased. The chain grew taut, with a final, deep-toned thrum times that vibrated through the entire hull. The ship swung gently, obediently, around this new fixed point. The forward motion, maintained for 10,000 miles, was gone. They were stopped. Dusk began to gather, softening the harsh lines of the clearing. The sun vanished behind the western hills, and the sky faded through shades of lavender and ash gray. In the settlement, the hearth fire smokes thickened, glowing with a warm orange core as cooking fires were stoked for the evening. Lamplight began to flicker in the windows of the cabins, tiny, steady stars at the forest's edge. Aboard Time's The Hopeful Venture, her own lanterns were lit, the stern lantern first, then the smaller sidelights their warm, yellow glow, reflecting in a trembling path on the darkening river. These lights did not battle the immense darkness of the ocean night, but held their own in a smaller, sheltered world, painting the ship's rigging and rails in soft, familiar gold. The long journey was complete. The stillness was no longer the tense, expectant quiet of the deep sea, but a profound, earned peace. The ship was now a permanent, if temporary, part of a new landscape. The sounds were terrestrial, the murmur of the river against the hull, the distant cry of a whippoorwill from the woods, the crackle of a fire from the shore. The smells were of mud, wood smoke, and night-blooming flowers. The great, creaking wooden world that had been a universe unto itself was now just another object on the water, its journey dissolved into the stillness of the sheltered river. Its masts pointed not at guiding stars, but at the dark, tangled branches of an unknown forest. Its anchor was set not in the ooze of a familiar harbor, but in the mud of a new continent. Around it, the night deepened, the lanterns glowed, and the vast, patient land waited. Think about this. That person who crossed the Atlantic in 1700, who lived 10 weeks on that wooden ship, who survived the storms, the hunger, the disease, who finally set foot on new land. That person is probably your ancestor. Somehow, someone in your family tree made that journey, or one like it, because that's how most of us got to where we are. Someone boarded a ship. Someone risked everything. Someone crossed the impossible. And us. We crossed the same ocean in 8 hours, complaining about the airplane Wi-Fi. I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty. I'm saying it because it's fascinating. In just 300 years, we turned an epic 10-week journey into a half-day inconvenience. The ocean didn't change. It's still the same Atlantic. What changed was us, our technology, our audacity, our ability to turn the impossible into ordinary. But we lost something in the process. We lost the wonder. The person who stepped off Time's, the hopeful venture, Time's, in 1700, and set foot on land after 10 weeks. They kissed the ground. They cried. They felt every cell in their body grateful to be alive. When was the last time you felt that after a flight? This story isn't just about what the past was like. It's about what we forgot about the present. That every transoceanic journey is a miracle. That crossing a continent is extraordinary. That being alive, in motion, exploring, was always extraordinary. We just stopped noticing. So next time you cross the Atlantic, in your airplane with Wi-Fi and movies, take a second, look out the window, and remember that down there, in that same ocean, there's a wooden ship with 200 people who've been sailing for 7 weeks, who don't know if they'll arrive, who are living the journey of their lives. And that, your 8-hour flight, would have been pure magic to them. Thank you for taking this journey with me. If it transported you to another time, share it. And if you want more journeys like this, you know what to do.